At dawn, the nurses woke to the rumble that rolled through the limestone caves like thunder trapped in a drum. The floor trembled, dust sifted from the ceiling, speckling the oilcloth that covered crates of sulfur powder and morphine ampules. Someone far down the tunnel screamed, a thin, tearing sound that rose and fell until it ended in a wet cough. Then came the smell, burned cordite and hot metal, and under it the sweet-sour taint of bodies that had lain too long. Aiko Tanaka counted 5 heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then exhaled and pushed up from her mat. Counting kept the panic out. She had learned that after the first night in the cave, when mortars stitched the hillside and her hands shook so badly she snapped a glass syringe. Now she straightened the white cloth around her hair and stood, a small figure dwarfed by shadow. "Light," she said. Hana cupped her hands around the lantern's chimney, coaxing it higher. The flame took, revealing faces. Keiko, with the soft oval cheeks that made her seem younger than 19. Mariko, with eyes too large in a too thin face. And Sayuri, wiry and precise, who could set a splint with a carpenter's patience. They were nurses by training and by the necessity of war, daughters of shopkeepers and fishermen from Nagasaki, Shizuoka, Saitama, stitched together by a uniform and an oath. Outside the hospital alcove, the main tunnel was a living thing, bodies moving in pulses, whispers turning to orders, orders dissolving into questions that had no answers. A junior officer clattered past, sword at his hip and a bandage darkening on his shoulder. "Prepare for evacuation," he barked to no one and everyone. "Destroy what cannot be taken." His voice broke on the last word, and Aiko wondered if he knew what that would mean. The first patient arrived before the words had finished echoing. He was carried on a door pried from a farmhouse, 2 men at his shoulders, 2 at his feet. "Nakao, 3rd Battalion," one of them said. "Stomach." He lifted the blanket and braced his face. The shot had torn raw through the lower abdomen. Intestinal loops glistened in the lantern light. The smell brought flies even in the cave. Aiko swallowed once. Boiled water. Sulfur. She spoke calmly, and the calm was real, or real enough to anchor the others. "Sayuri compresses. Keiko, prepare morphine. Half dose first." She looked to Hana. "Keep the lamp steady." They worked. Swab, compress, irrigate, pack, lace the edges with trembling catgut. Nakao's breath hitched, steadied, slowed. Keiko's lips moved in a silent prayer, an old childhood charm against nightmares. Aiko didn't pray. She believed in small things, clean instruments, timely bandages, water that had really boiled, not pretended to. They were the only miracles she could count on. By mid-morning, the cave had warmed. The air tasted like tin. Word traveled along the tunnel that the Americans, Marines, the word passed like a rumor of a storm, had pushed inland from the beaches and were cutting the road near Garapan. Someone claimed they'd seen tanks crawling like black beetles along the cane fields. Someone else said the tanks were invulnerable, that bullets slid off as rain slides from roof tiles. Lies and truth braided together. The braid was all that kept them from unraveling. An older surgeon, Lieutenant Ishii, came to their alcove with his spectacles fogged, his hair sticking damply to his forehead. He had been gentle the first weeks, pausing to ask each nurse where she was from, what foods she missed most. Today his gentleness was buried under urgency. "We cannot hold here," he said, not unkindly. "The entrance is vulnerable to shelling. Orders are to move to the secondary cavern and prepare for surrender or—" He stopped himself, and the phrase hung like a trap in the air, or honorable death. Sayuri's jaw clenched. Keiko's eyes flicked to the small wooden amulet she kept tucked at her neckline. Mariko wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the floor where the limestone glistened like cold fat. Aiko met Ishii's gaze. "We still have 12 critical," she said. Two cannot be moved. Ishi's mouth hardened. Move them anyway, he said, or give them morphine. He didn't have to say the rest. The first shell landed close enough to suck the breath from their chests. Pebbles spattered like rain. Somewhere down the tunnel a lantern shattered, flame whooshing and then dying with a belch of smoke. Someone laughed in that thin, too high way. Laughter sometimes comes when it has no business arriving. Aiko went patient to patient, dressing the stump of a leg that ended mid-thigh, adjusting the splints on a boy whose clavicle had snapped like a twig, smoothing the hair back from a private who called for his mother in a Kansai lilt so thick Aiko could almost see the street where he'd learned it. She said his name. Sato Kenji, Sato Kenji, until his eyes found hers and his breathing slowed. Tanaka-san, Hana whispered at her shoulder. If they find us, they will, Aiko said, and the truth sat between them like a cool bowl of water. She took Hana's hand briefly and squeezed. We will do our work until they do. The next hour was a flood. Civilians came, women with hair cut raggedly short to keep the lice down, boys with scraped knees and fists clenched to make themselves look brave. An old man with a wound that was mostly shock and exhaustion stood swaying, muttering that the Emperor would send a fleet, that the air would darken with planes. Mariko led him to a bench and pressed a cup of barley tea to his lip. Drink, she said. Think of the sea. He obeyed like a scolded child. From the far end of the tunnel, someone hissed, Americans, and the word moved as quickly as any fever. They came with voices first, low commands in a music Aiko did not understand. English had always seemed to her like a stream rushing over stones, syllables tumbling, consonants clacking. Now it rolled into the cave, a foreign tide. The soldiers' boots scraped limestone. The smell of their uniforms hit. Canvas and sweat, a different soap. Aiko stood straight. Her hands were blood to the wrists. She wiped them on a rag, then on another when the first only smeared it. She felt every beat of her heart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then stepped forward into the open of the tunnel. The first Marine she saw was younger than she expected, with freckles ghosting his nose and a jaw that clenched and unclenched as if chewing a tough piece of thought. His rifle swept, then dipped when his eyes took in the stretcher rows and the lamp glow on bandages. Behind him moved a taller man with a square face and a scar on his chin. Not recent, but pale and old, as if he'd learned long ago what hard things could do to soft skin. He wore sergeant's stripes, dark against the khaki. Aiko raised her hands, each finger open. Her voice surprised her by coming out steady. We are medical personnel, she said in Japanese first, then with careful vowels, nurses. The sergeant's gaze slid from her hands to her face. He spoke a single word to the freckled soldier, who lowered his rifle a fraction. Then the sergeant said slowly, We, not hurt. You. He patted his chest, then made a small awkward bow that startled Aiko so much she almost smiled. Safe, he said. He pointed to the wounded. Help, Aiko blinked. The shape of this possibility hadn't fit inside her mind. She had prepared for screaming, for blows, for the flick of a bayonet. She had not prepared for help. Behind her, Sayuri whispered. Aiko? Aiko nodded once, as if giving a command she had no authority to give. We continue, she said in Japanese. We accept aid. The words felt like stepping off a cliff and finding a ledge where you thought there would only be air. The freckled Marine, he couldn't have been more than 20, fumbled with a canteen, unscrewed it, thrust it toward her. She hesitated, then took a mouthful. The water was clean and tasted faintly of metal. It slid down her throat like forgiveness. Arigato, she said. She expected him not to understand. When his face softened, she wondered if gratitude didn't need translation. The sergeant, Tom Harrington, she would later learn, moved through the cave with deliberate care. He kept his hands visible, as if approaching a wild animal he didn't want to spook. He crouched by Nakao, the abdominal wound, the one they'd packed and prayed over, and his mouth pressed into a line. He spoke to one of his men who jogged back toward the cave mouth and returned with a canvas satchel marked with a red cross. "Medic," Harrington said, touching his own chest, then pointing to the man with the satchel. "Doc." The medic knelt and met Aiko's eyes, waiting for permission. She found herself giving it with a small tilt of her head. He opened the satchel. Inside, gauze, tins of sulfa, vials with labels in English, rubber tourniquets, ampules packed so neatly, Aiko's fingers itched to reorder them in the system she knew. He worked fast, but not carelessly, and when he reached for Nakao's bandaging, Aiko stopped him with a lifted finger. She pointed to the packing, to the places where the sutures skirted the danger. He blinked, understood, and gentled his hands. They worked side by side. Language narrowed to gesture. A palm lifted mean weight. A finger tap said here, a nod said yes, and a head tilt said no. Hana ferried water, as if she'd never known another task. Sayuri kept count of morphine ampules. 1, 2, 3, lining emptied glass along the lip of a crate, as if building a fragile city. Mariko gathered the civilians to one side, her voice a thread that stitched them still. More Marines filtered in, keeping their rifles angled toward the floor. One watched the entrance. 2 took up stations near the stretchers, eyes flitting but not unkind. Aiko realized with a start that she recognized the corners of their fear. It looked like theirs, but with different uniforms. Fear, she thought, was an international language. At some point, the cave breathed differently. The edges of sound softened. Even the shelling outside seemed to fall away a step. Aiko's shoulders dropped an inch. She didn't remember deciding to sit, but she found herself on an overturned crate, while Keiko wrapped linen around her wrists where the dried blood cracked the skin. Harrington crouched to her eye level, and up close, Aiko could see his stubble, the pale fan of a scar that licked his chin. He extended a small rectangle wrapped in brown paper. When she made no move, he peeled it open to reveal a square of something dark and glossy, divided into neat tiles. "Chocolate," he said carefully, as if introducing a friend. He broke a corner and popped it into his own mouth, chewed, made an exaggerated face of delight that would have been ridiculous if it hadn't been so earnest. He offered the rest. Aiko took a tiny bite. Sweetness flooded her mouth so suddenly her eyes watered. She fought the impulse to laugh. The sound that escaped was half-sob instead, which embarrassed her so much she flushed to her hairline. Harrington pretended not to notice. He broke pieces into smaller bits and handed them to Hana, to Sayuri, to Keiko, to Mariko. The women ate like children who had been told the festival sweets were for everyone this year, not just the rich girls. From deeper in the cave, Ishii appeared. He'd found a scrap of white cloth to tie around his upper arm, a makeshift flag of surrender that looked strange and small on his sleeve. He approached Harrington and bowed, not too low, but with dignity. He spoke in formal Japanese. Harrington answered in English, and it should have been farce, but it wasn't. Meaning stitched itself, anyway. Ishii gestured to the wounded who could not be moved. Harrington nodded and spoke to his men. 2 Marines disappeared and returned with a stretcher that looked newer than the door they had used, the canvas not yet sweat-marked. "Tanaka-san," Ishii said, turning to Aiko, using the honorific that had grown heavier and heavier these last days. "You will oversee transfer. You are steady." The compliment was like a hand on her shoulder. She straightened under it. "Yes, Sensei," she said. They began the careful choreography of evacuation. Aiko placed those who could travel near the entrance, those who could not, to the center where the air was cooler and the ceiling higher. Marines took the heavier lifts without swagger. A boy no older than 16 clutched a ragged stuffed crane and resisted every hand that touched him until Keiko knelt and told him a story about cranes that lived 1,000 years. He relaxed, and a Marine scooped him as if he were glass. At the cave mouth, afternoon burned white. The sun hit Aiko like a slap after days underground. She blinked rapidly, and the world resolved. Scorched scrub, the shattered skeletons of trees, smoke lifting from the direction of the village in black-tipped fingers. Above it all, the sky was an improbable blue, the kind of blue that should belong to picnics and weddings. Not to this. On a ridge beyond, Aiko saw movement and realized with a shock that it was civilians, lines of them, waving the white flags they had been told meant shame, then told meant life. She had dreamt of this moment as terror. Instead, it was something stranger. Her fear didn't disappear. It simply took a step to the left to make room for awe. "Watch your step," Harrington said. The words flat, but the tone kind. He placed his palm out, not touching her back, but offering the idea of steadiness. She didn't need it. Still, she was glad for the shadow of it there. They crossed to a clearing where Marines had set up a temporary aid station. Canvas tents, cots in neat rows, the Red Cross painted on boards propped against crates. An American flag hung limply on a halyard, heavy with humidity. As they entered the shade, the temperature dropped, and Aiko could almost feel her bones stop rattling. A medic led her to a basin and gestured. She held her hands out as he poured clear water from a canteen, blood streaked red and then pink, and then finally the clean pale of skin. He offered her a bar of soap. She lathered, rinsed, lathered again. The second lather was not for cleanliness, she realized, but for the sensation, the simple miracle of a thing that smelled faintly of pine, that did the job it promised. "Name?" Harrington asked, tapping his chest. "Tom." He touched his chin, scar to name. "Tom." He pointed to her. "Aiko," she said. Then, more formal, "Tanaka Aiko." He tried it on his tongue. "Ah, Iko," he said, slightly wrong and earnest enough to make it right. He nodded once as if settling a ledger entry. Around them, the measured bustle of care continued. Bandages unrolled, pulses counted, cups of water brought and held patiently to split lips. Civilians were guided to one area, soldiers to another, nurses to a small cluster of cots set aside, like a thought held in the palm. A Marine handed Aiko a blanket. It was coarse and smelled of sun and canvas. She hadn't realized she was cold until warmth pooled around her shoulders. As dusk braided itself into the palm fronds, the world softened by a degree. The shelling retreated like weather moving offshore. A chorus of insects took over, loud and insistent, unbothered by the lines men drew or the orders they obeyed. Aiko sat on the edge of a cot and listened to her own breathing count itself. Ishi came by once more. He stood at the edge of her vision like a sentence not yet spoken. "We are prisoners," he said finally, so quietly she could have pretended not to hear. He folded and unfolded his hands. "It appears we will live to see what that means." Aiko looked toward the tent flap, where the evening wind lifted the canvas like the hem of a kimono. Beyond, she saw the silhouettes of Marines moving against a sky that glowed with the last of the day. She thought of the boys who had called for their mothers, of the old man who had sipped barley tea, of the medic who had waited for her nod. "Yes," she said, "we will see." When the night finally came, deep and complete, she lay with the blanket tucked under her chin. and the lantern hissing softly overhead. Sleep hovered but did not land. Instead, she let her mind walk back through the day, placing it in order. The first shell, the freckled boy, the taste of chocolate, the weightless moment when an enemy's hand hovered near her back, and she did not flinch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She counted her heartbeats again, but now the numbers matched a different rhythm. Not fear, but a strange, tilted hope, as if the world had slipped on its axis and found, against all prediction, a new balance. In the morning, she would rise and work again. The uniforms around her would still be the wrong color. The flag on the halyard would still be the wrong flag. But the wounded would still need dressing, and water would still need boiling, and the word arigato would still fit in her mouth. And perhaps, she thought as she finally sank, the distance between enemies could be measured not in miles or years, but in the small, steady work of hands. The transport ship that carried them away from Saipan moved slowly. Too slowly for Aiko's liking. For 3 days and 2 nights, the vessel rolled across the restless Pacific, its decks creaking beneath the weight of prisoners and supplies. The women had been separated from the wounded, and most of the soldiers placed instead with civilians and other non-combatant captives. The hold was hot and smelled of sweat, salt, and machine oil. The sea air that slipped in through narrow portholes was their only relief. Aiko spent much of the voyage sitting cross-legged near the wall, watching the water through a sliver of metal grating. The color of the ocean shifted as the sun rose and fell. Deep cobalt at dawn, green-black by dusk. It was beautiful in a way she had never allowed herself to see before. Perhaps it was because she was no longer watching for enemy ships or listening for distant artillery. Perhaps it was because she had no choice but to see it now. Hana rested her head on Aiko's lap, asleep and murmuring softly in dreams. Keiko and Mariko whispered nearby, sharing what remained of a small piece of chocolate Corporal Miller had pressed into Keiko's hand before they left. Sayuri, ever practical, was sewing up a tear in her dress with a piece of thread salvaged from an old bandage. "They are not as we were told," Keiko said at one point, breaking the silence. "No," Mariko agreed. "They are men, like ours. Different, but not monsters," Sayuri added, without looking up from her work. Aiko didn't speak. She wasn't ready yet. Her heart was still tangled. Part shame, part relief, part confusion. It was disorienting to have the image of the American, the devil, the beast, the enemy, replaced with men who offered chocolate, water, and even kindness. Arrival at Camp Stockton, when the transport finally docked in Hawaii. The prisoners were transferred to a smaller ship and taken to a prisoner-of-war camp on the outskirts of Honolulu. It was called Camp Stockton, a place built originally for Japanese male POWs, but later expanded to house civilians and non-combatants. The camp was surrounded by high barbed wire fences, but the grounds inside were not what they had imagined. There were neat rows of barracks, a small hospital, a mess hall, and even a makeshift garden where prisoners grew vegetables. American guards walked their patrols with rifles slung over their shoulders, but their expressions were bored more than hostile. "This is prison?" Hana whispered as they were led through the gates. "It is not so bad," Mariko murmured, almost guiltily. Each woman was assigned a bunk and issued a plain khaki dress, soap, a toothbrush, and 2 pairs of socks. They were registered, photographed, and given identification tags with numbers instead of names. To the Americans, they were not Aiko, Hana, Keiko, Mariko, and Sayuri. They were simply Nam 457, Farafemidiut, Farafemidin, Brafsext, and Farsto 61. But the camp was not all barbed wire and routine. There were English lessons taught twice a week, and Iko signed up immediately. Books and newspapers were available in a small library. Some prisoners were even allowed to work tending gardens, sewing uniforms, or helping in the medical tent. Iko volunteered there, too, tending to sick prisoners and occasionally American soldiers recovering from minor illnesses. Her hands, once used to treating bleeding soldiers in dark caves, now cleaned scrapes, wrapped sprains, and measured medicine. It was here she often saw Sergeant Tom Harrington again. The language of kindness. Tom visited the infirmary almost every other day. He would check on the POW patients, sometimes bringing magazines or small candies, other times just chatting with the American nurses. But he always stopped by Iko's station, even if only to nod politely. "Good morning, Miss Tanaka," he would say, careful and slow, emphasizing each word as if afraid they might break. "Good morning, Sergeant Harrington," she would reply, her accent thick, but her confidence growing. Their conversations started simple. He would teach her words: bandage, medicine, suture. In return, she taught him their Japanese equivalents: hotai, kusuri, nuimono. At first it was language for work, but slowly it became language for life. "Do you miss Japan?" he asked one afternoon while she folded gauze. Iko hesitated. "Yes, I miss my mother. I miss rain in Tokyo. And my books." "What kind of books?" "Poetry, basho, and—" "Novels by Natsume Soseki," she smiled shyly. "And silly romance stories." Tom laughed. "Romance, huh? Maybe we're not so different after all. My sister reads those too." The conversation warmed her. It was the first time she had spoken of home since the surrender. The first time she had felt, even briefly, like more than a prisoner. Cracks in the walls. Not all the women adapted so quickly. Hana grew quiet and withdrawn, rarely speaking even during meals. Mariko cried herself to sleep for weeks, mourning the fiancé she would never see again. Sayuri refused to speak English at all, insisting on writing poetry in the dirt with a stick, poems about home and honor and cherry blossoms that would never bloom again. Yet even they could not ignore the humanity around them. Guards shared cigarettes and stories. Medical officers showed them how to use new instruments. One soldier even brought Mariko a small music box after learning she loved music, something his own mother had sent him from back home. It was disarming, dangerous even. The women began to feel less like captives and more like guests, albeit guests who could not leave. And with that feeling came something unexpected. Attraction. Keiko was the first to fall. Corporal James Miller, the quiet, soft-spoken farm boy from Iowa, taught her English twice a week. He had sandy hair, kind eyes, and a shy smile that made her stomach flutter. He brought her apples from the commissary, and once even gave her a paperback English novel, dog-eared and well-loved. "Keiko," he said one afternoon, struggling with pronunciation. "You are strong, brave." She blushed so hard she had to turn away. "No, I am only nurse." "You are more." Mariko developed a fondness for Private Ellis, a clumsy young man who helped repair the infirmary roof and always tipped his hat when he passed. Even Sayuri, who had sworn never to speak to an American, found herself smiling when Lieutenant Carter quoted bits of haiku he had found in a library book. And Iko, she could not deny the way her heart quickened when Tom Harrington entered the room. Confessions under a foreign sky. It was a cool October evening when Iko first realized what she felt was no mere gratitude. The POWs had been granted permission to walk in the outer yard after dinner, a rare privilege. The sky above was painted in deep purples and golds, and the air smelled faintly of the sea. Tom approached her as she stood near the fence, watching the horizon. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Yes," she answered softly. "It looks like home." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Tom sighed. "I used to come here with my brother before he enlisted. He never came back from Pearl Harbor." Aiko's chest tightened. "I am sorry." "It's not your fault," he said. "War, it makes enemies of people who might have been friends." She turned to him, searching his face. There was sadness there, but not hatred, pain, but not anger. And in that moment, she felt something shift inside her. Something she had not felt since before the war. Hope. Days passed. Their conversations grew longer, deeper. They spoke of books, of food, of childhood memories. Tom confessed he missed his mother's apple pie. Aiko confessed she missed the sound of cicadas in summer. It was as if, through words, they were stitching together two broken worlds. Then one evening, as the guards dimmed the lights, Aiko whispered the words that had been building inside her. "Tom, when the war is over, could you take me with you?" He stared at her, stunned, as if he had misheard. But the question hung in the air, trembling and real. Aiko's cheeks burned. "I want to see your country. I want to be with you." For a long time, Tom said nothing. His jaw tightened, and he looked away at the sky, now dark and full of stars. "Aiko," he said finally, his voice gentle but heavy. "I can't." The words were like a blow. She blinked, unsure if she had understood. "Can't? Why?" "Because," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, "I have a life back home, a family, a future I need to figure out. And this war, it's complicated. You and I, we're on opposite sides of something bigger than both of us." She lowered her gaze. "Because I am Japanese." "No," he said firmly. "Because this isn't the time, maybe not the place, maybe not ever." The silence that followed was heavy. Aiko's heart felt as though it had been pulled from her chest, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand." After the proposal word of Aiko's failed confession spread quietly among the women, Keiko, emboldened by her friend's courage, confessed her feelings to Corporal Miller. He, too, gently rejected her, explaining that he had a fiancée waiting in Iowa and a farm to return to. Mariko wrote a love letter to Private Ellis but tore it up before he could ever see it. Even Sayuri, who had scoffed at the idea of love, wept one night beneath her blanket, though she never said why. The rejections were painful, humiliating even. They had believed that kindness was the first step toward something deeper. They had believed that love might bridge the vast chasm carved by war. Instead, they learned that kindness did not always lead to love, that sometimes the very people who made you feel human again could not, or would not, love you back. But beneath the sadness, a strange new understanding began to grow. The Americans had not mocked them. They had not exploited their feelings. They had simply told the truth, and in that truth, there was a kind of respect. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and the Pacific wind rustled through the barbed wire, Aiko lay awake, staring at the stars. She was no longer the same woman who had entered this camp. Terrified, angry, and ashamed. She was something different now. Her heart ached. Yes, but it also beat with a new strength. If love cannot bridge the gap, she whispered into the darkness, then perhaps understanding can. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, no longer dreaming of fairy tale endings, but of a world where enemies could speak, and maybe someday forgive. The rainy season came late to Oahu that year. By November, the skies had turned heavy and silver, and the POW camp was wrapped in the sound of falling water. It hissed against the tin roofs of the barracks, trickled down the drainage ditches, and soaked the earth until the ground felt soft underfoot. For Aiko, the rain brought a strange kind of peace. It reminded her of home, of quiet mornings in Tokyo when she would read poetry by candlelight, the steady rhythm of water against her window pane her only companion. But the rain also brought reflection, and reflection, she had learned, was dangerous. It had been weeks since she had whispered her timid confession to Tom Harrington, weeks since his kind but firm rejection. Yet the words still replayed in her mind, like a wound she couldn't stop touching. I can't, Aiko. I have a life back home. It's not that simple. She had told herself to forget, to move on, to bury her foolish feelings under duty and dignity. But the heart, she realized, was not a soldier. It did not obey orders, and she was not the only one suffering under the weight of unspoken love. Keiko's hope. Now Keiko had become the heart of the small group, her laughter the only thing that could cut through the monotony of camp life. She was the youngest among them, still barely 20, and her optimism had been their anchor through the darkest days. But even she could not hide the tremor in her hands whenever Corporal James Miller walked by. Miller had grown fond of Keiko, too. He always had a kind word, a smile, a book for her to practice reading. He brought her apples, taught her English slang, and listened patiently as she told him about her hometown near Kyoto. It was a gentle, innocent connection, or so she thought. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the rain softened to a drizzle, Keiko gathered her courage. She had spent the entire day practicing what she would say, repeating the words until they felt natural in her mouth. "James," she said, approaching him near the wire fence where they sometimes met during patrol breaks. "I want to tell you something." He turned toward her with a warm smile. "Sure, Keiko, what's on your mind?" Her heart pounded. "When war is over, I want to go with you. To America. Maybe be with you." The words tumbled out more clumsily than she had rehearsed, but they were honest. Miller's smile faded. He blinked, taken aback, and for a long, painful moment, he didn't say anything at all. "Keiko," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "I care about you. Truly, you're a wonderful person. But I can't. I have someone waiting for me back home. A fiancé. We're going to be married." Keiko's breath caught. "Fiancé?" she repeated, the foreign word tasting bitter on her tongue. He nodded, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I never meant to give you the wrong idea. I just wanted to help you through this. I didn't know." The words dissolved into the rain. Keiko bowed her head, her cheeks burning. "I am sorry. I was foolish." "No," Miller said quickly. "You're not foolish. I'm honored, Keiko. Really. And I'll never forget you." But the words, though kind, could not soften the blow. That night, Keiko cried quietly into her pillow, her tears mixing with the rhythm of the rain, Mariko's secret letter. Mariko had always been the most reserved among them, delicate in manner, shy with words, more comfortable expressing herself through letters and poems than in conversation. Yet even she could not escape the tide of emotions sweeping through the camp. Her heart had betrayed her, too. It was Private Ellis, clumsy, earnest, and hopelessly polite, who had caught her attention. He often repaired fences and delivered supplies near the infirmary. Once, when Mariko had slipped on the muddy ground, Ellis had caught her before she fell, stammering apologies as he helped her to her feet. That simple act of kindness had lived rent-free in her mind ever since. She had started writing him letters she never intended to send. In them, she wrote about the life she dreamed of, living in a small house near a river, growing flowers in a garden, reading books in English she hoped one day to understand. It was foolish and childish, she knew, but it made her feel alive again. One rainy afternoon, after reading one of those letters over and over, she decided to take a chance. Folding it carefully, she tucked it into an envelope and slipped it into the pocket of Ellis's supply crate when no one was watching. For 2 days, she lived in agony, waiting for a response that never came. Then, on the 3rd day, the letter returned, unopened, with a small note attached in Ellis's clumsy handwriting. "I'm sorry, Miss Mariko. I don't think it would be right. I hope we can still be friends." The rejection, though gentle, was crushing. Mariko burned the letter that night, watching as the paper curled and blackened in the small stove. She told no one, but the next morning, her eyes were rimmed with red, and the poetry she scribbled in the dirt was darker than before. Sayuri's walls Sayuri had always sworn that she would never fall for an American. "They killed my brother," she would say flatly whenever the topic came up. "They bombed our village. They are not worthy of love." But even Sayuri was not immune to the strange, quiet charm of Lieutenant Carter, the officer who quoted haiku. He was older than the other soldiers, perhaps in his 30s, with streaks of gray beginning to show in his hair. He had been a teacher before the war and spoke slowly, carefully, always with an air of thoughtfulness. Once, after overhearing Sayuri reciting a poem by Basho, he responded by quoting one back, in near-perfect Japanese, an old silent pond. A frog jumps into the water. Splash! Silence again. It was a simple exchange, but it disarmed her. Against her better judgment, she began to speak with him during his patrols, discussing literature, history, and even philosophy. The conversations were always proper, always distant, but they stirred something inside her that she thought the war had killed. One afternoon, Carter offered her a small book, a translated collection of haiku. "Keep it," he said. "It's a gift." Sayuri stared at it, then shook her head. "Why are you kind to me?" He smiled. "Because I see a person, not an enemy." She said nothing, but her heart betrayed her. It beat faster than it had in years. She never confessed her feelings. She didn't have to. The barrier between them was clear, written in barbed wire and blood. But the ache she felt whenever he passed was real, and it humbled her. Eiko's second chance. For Eiko, the weeks after Tom's rejection were a storm of conflicting emotions. She threw herself into her work, volunteering for extra shifts at the infirmary, translating medical reports, even helping American nurses with their duties. The busier she was, the less she had to think about the night under the stars, the night her heart had been gently turned away. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her and Tom. One evening, a supply truck overturned near the camp's entrance, injuring several guards. Eiko rushed to help, tending to a young man with a broken leg. Tom was there too, barking orders, his hands stained with blood as he helped lift debris. They worked side by side for hours, their movements instinctively coordinated. When the crisis was over and the wounded were safe, Tom turned to her, exhaustion etched into his features. "You saved lives tonight," he said. "So did you." She replied softly. There was a long silence between them. Then Tom spoke again, his voice heavy. "I hope I didn't hurt you that night. When you asked me." "You did," Eiko admitted. "But you were honest. That is better than a lie." Tom looked down at the ground, rain pooling at his boots. "I care about you, Eiko, more than I probably should. But the world, it's complicated." "I know," she said. "It is complicated for me, too." Then after a moment, "Maybe we can still be friends." Tom smiled, a small tired smile. "I'd like that." Lessons of the heart by winter, the romantic dreams that had once fluttered like butterflies inside the hearts of the women, had settled into something quieter, something deeper. They had learned that love was not a fairy tale that could erase the past. It was not a balm strong enough to heal every wound, but they had also learned something else. That rejection did not mean hatred, that kindness could exist without romance, and that the bridges between enemies, though fragile, could still be built, even if they did not lead where one expected. One cold December night, the 5 women sat together in their barracks, the rain drumming softly on the roof. Keiko was knitting a scarf, Mariko was writing a new poem, Sayuri was reading her haiku book, Hana was humming an old folk song, and Aiko, for the first time in months, was simply smiling. "We were foolish," Keiko said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "thinking they would love us." "Not foolish," Sayuri corrected. "Just human." "Yes," Aiko agreed. "We are all human, and maybe that is more important than love." The others nodded. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady, cleansing, endless, and for the first time since the war had begun, Aiko felt that perhaps the storm inside her heart had finally begun to pass. The winter of 1945 in Camp Stockton was quieter than any the women could remember. The distant echoes of war still rumbled across the Pacific. Battles in the Philippines, bombing raids over Tokyo, 1,000,000 lives still hanging in the balance. But inside the barbed wire fences of the prisoner of war camp, time seemed to slow. By now Aiko and her companions had fallen into a routine. They woke at dawn, swept the floors of their barracks, and lined up for breakfast. Oatmeal, sometimes eggs if the supply ships had arrived. Always the bitter black coffee that none of them could quite get used to. After breakfast, they went to their assigned duties. Aiko and Sayuri in the infirmary, Keiko in the sewing workshop, Hana in the gardens, and Mariko in the small library where she had become the unofficial translator of Japanese books for curious American soldiers. It was a strange existence. Half prison, half village. The guards still patrolled with rifles and shouted orders during roll call, but they also waved and said, "Good morning," in broken Japanese. The fences still loomed high and sharp, but they no longer looked like cages. More like the lines of a map that none of them had drawn but had all learned to live within. Yet beneath the calm surface, something profound was happening. The women were changing. The soldiers were changing. Even the camp itself was changing. And all of them knew, though few dared to say it, that the end was coming. Rumors of surrender it began with whispers. One cold February morning, Mariko overheard 2 guards talking outside the library. One of them, a tall man from Chicago, was saying something about the U.S. bombing Japanese cities with terrifying new ferocity. Another mentioned that the Imperial Army was losing ground everywhere. In Burma, in Iwo Jima, in Okinawa. "They'll crack soon," one said. "It's just a matter of time." Mariko's heart pounded as she repeated the news to the others that night in their barracks. For a long time no one spoke. "Do you think it's true?" Keiko asked, her voice trembling. "It must be," Hana murmured. "The war cannot last forever." Sayuri clenched her fists. "And when it ends? What then? Will they let us go?" Aiko stared at the floorboards. "Yes," she said. "They will, and we will have to decide what comes next." It was a frightening thought. Freedom was something they had dreamed of for months. But now that it was within reach, it seemed less like salvation and more like a question. Where would they go? What would they do? What kind of Japan would they return to? If there was even a Japan left to return to. Changing hearts. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The guards grew more relaxed. The prisoners were given more freedom. Longer walks outside, more books, even a small celebration for New Year's. The women were invited to help decorate the dining hall with paper cranes and calligraphy scrolls. On one of those afternoons, as Aiko carefully brushed ink onto paper, Tom Harrington approached her. His sleeves were rolled up, his hair a little longer than usual. He carried 2 cups of tea, one for himself, one for her. "Happy New Year, Aiko," he said, handing her a cup. "Happy New Year, Sergeant," she replied, bowing slightly. They sat together at a table by the window, watching the rain blur the world beyond the fences. It was a silence they had grown comfortable with. Not awkward, but thoughtful. "You know," Tom said after a while, "I never thought I'd spend a New Year with people I used to call the enemy." Aiko smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd celebrate with the enemy either." "Doesn't feel like that anymore, does it?" She shook her head. "No, it feels different." They didn't say the word friendship, but it hung in the air between them. Fragile, tentative, but real. Later that evening, as the camp gathered for a small feast of rice, vegetables, and even a few rare slices of meat, Aiko looked around the room. American soldiers laughed with Japanese prisoners. Guards clinked tin cups with doctors they once would have shot on sight. It was a surreal scene. Enemies breaking bread together. And for the first time since the war began, Aiko allowed herself to believe that reconciliation was possible. Letters from home in March. A new privilege was granted. Prisoners were allowed to receive letters from home. It had been nearly a year since any of the women had heard from their families. They lined up outside the administrative office, hearts pounding, as the camp interpreter called out names one by one. Hana received a letter from her parents in Osaka. Their home had been damaged in a bombing, but they were alive. Keiko received one from her younger brother, who wrote about planting vegetables and dreaming of her return. Mariko's letter came from a childhood friend who had survived the Tokyo firebombing. Aiko's letter came from her mother. Her hands shook as she unfolded the thin paper. The ink was faded, the handwriting uneven. But it was her mother's voice, gentle and loving, speaking across oceans and battlefields. "My dearest Aiko, I do not know if this letter will reach you, but I must try. The war has taken so much from us, yet I pray every day that it will not take you. Our home is gone, but the plum tree in the garden still blooms. It gives me hope. I think of you when I see its blossoms. Fragile, but strong enough to return each spring. Come home when you can, my daughter. We will begin again." Aiko pressed the letter to her chest, tears blurring the words. For the first time, home felt real again. Not just a memory, but a future. The end of the war, August 6, 1945. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. The Americans had dropped a new kind of bomb on Hiroshima, a weapon so powerful that a single explosion had leveled an entire city. 3 days later, they did it again in Nagasaki. The women listened in stunned silence as guards read out the headlines from English newspapers. None of them spoke. None of them could. On August 15th, the radio in the mess hall crackled with a faint, distant voice. It was the Emperor, speaking directly to the people of Japan for the first time in history. His words were formal, poetic, difficult for even the native speakers to understand, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Some prisoners wept openly. Others stared into the distance, too numb to react. Aiko simply sat down, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She thought of the soldiers who had died, the civilians who had suffered, the friends she had lost. She thought of her mother and the plum tree that still bloomed amid the ashes, and she thought of Tom Harrington, the man who had once been her enemy and was now something much more complicated. The last goodbye, the following weeks, were a blur of preparations. Lists were made, papers signed, ships scheduled, One by one, prisoners were processed for repatriation. The women packed their few belongings, a change of clothes, a few books, small keepsakes. The camp that had once been their prison was now just a place they were passing through. On their final day, Tom came to see Aiko off. "You'll be leaving tomorrow," he said, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I guess this is goodbye." Aiko nodded. "Yes, I will go home. I will see my mother again. I'm glad," he said, smiling faintly. "You deserve peace." There was a long silence. Neither wanted it to end. "Tom," Aiko said finally, "thank you for everything, for saving us, for treating us like humans." "You are human," he replied softly. "You always were. It just took a war for some of us to see it." She hesitated, then extended her hand. It was a small gesture, formal, almost businesslike, but it carried the weight of everything they had shared. Tom took it gently in his own, holding it a moment longer than necessary. "I will remember you," she said, "and I'll remember you." Then, with nothing left to say, they let go. Epilogue: The Plum Tree. The journey back to Japan was long and somber. When the ship finally docked in Yokohama, the women stepped onto a homeland they barely recognized. Cities were in ruins, fields lay barren, millions were displaced. Yet amid the devastation, there was life. People rebuilding, planting, hoping. Aiko found her mother in a small village outside Tokyo. The house was gone, but the plum tree still stood, just as the letter had said, scarred by fire, but blooming stubbornly against the gray sky. Under its branches, Aiko told her mother everything: the capture, the camp, the kindness of strangers, the heartbreak, the lessons learned. She spoke of Tom, of how he had shown her that enemies could become friends, even if love was impossible. Years later, when Aiko told her grandchildren about the war, she did not speak of battles or bombs. She spoke, instead of the camp, of the barbed wire and the chocolate, the rejections and the forgiveness, the strange and beautiful humanity that had grown between people who were supposed to hate each other. And she always ended her story the same way. Love is not always returned, but kindness. Kindness always finds its way back. Final lines. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their innocence, their illusions, but it had also given them something unexpected, a chance to see the world and themselves more clearly. Beyond the barbed wire, beyond the hatred and heartbreak, they discovered a truth deeper than love itself, that even in the darkest of times, humanity endures.